Be post July 4th, Spicy Monday. Today, we're going to continue talking about the rules of tech support from our Tales from Tech Support, and we are moving on to Rule 2 this week. You can't explain anything simply enough for an end user to understand it.
Spicy Monday, time to break it down. MSP Talk, ripping off the rails.
So if you're just catching up now, we are going through on Spicy Monday and highlighting some of the rules of tech support derived from Tales from Tech Support over the last decade of stories being posted there. Some of these rules are a little bit toxic, but all of them are based in quantifiable experience. And I think they're really interesting to dive in a little bit to why some of these rules are written the way they are. Last week's rule, we covered Rule 1, my most favorite rule, users lie, a rule that I agree very much with. Go watch that video if you want to see more. Today, we're going to be talking about Rule 2, a rule that I have far more nuanced feelings on. Rule 2, stated simply, explain everything as simply as possible. I think we can all agree that is amazing advice in tech support in general. And there you go. We're done. End of the episode. We'll be right back. Great job, everybody. But Rule 2 has two sub-rules. And that's where I start to have a bit of a problem with Rule 2 and think we can all learn a lesson from it. So if Rule 2 is explain everything as simply as possible, Rule 2A, there is no language simple enough to make a user understand anything. And Rule 2B, emojis are never an answer. Now, all of Rule 2 is correct, but it's also kind of flawed in its oversimplification. And that's what I want to talk about. So everybody's had that experience. If you worked in any sort of tech support or really any sort of support role around a concept that is not universally understood, right? And we've all tried to explain things clearly, been met with confusion. And we find that at our MSPs, right, techs often default to dumbing things down. That makes sense. A lot of us have in our marketing, we don't speak the geek or we don't talk the tech. So it would even bent out of shape about. Well, it's because techs often default to dumbing things down instead of reframing the explanation around outcome. So that brings us to the real problem that I have with Rule 2 is Rule 2 really should be about misaligned outcomes. Users don't always want the technical solution or explanation, which we understand, but they do want a functional result. And a great example of this, a very basic form of tech support, you work at an ISP, somebody calls in because the internet's not working, you're an ISP tech, and you're trying to explain to them how to walk over, find what we call a modem, and see if the blinky lights are blinking. And in our mind, well, the outcome's obvious. They want the internet restored. I don't have to start from there. Of course they understand that. And I might even restate that. But is that actually the outcome? So we think modem issue, but what they actually want is to get Disney Plus working again because they have a room full of children. Now, you and I both know that for Disney Plus to work, the internet has to work. Therefore, the main problem is the internet's out. But that's not actually the outcome they want. That is ancillary to the outcome, which is to get Disney Plus back on so the kids will shut up. There's a difference. Support fails when we don't first clarify what the outcome is that the user actually wants. So how do we fix Rule 2A, that there is no language simple enough to have a user understand anything? Well, there absolutely is language simple enough if you align it with the user's objective and their level of interest and understanding. The other day, I was at an outdoor party. My brother-in-law was flying a very, very expensive FPV drone. He had a full headset for it. I do not know why anybody needs to own this for recreation. Thing's freaking cool. And one of the guests at the event we were at had a little kid, and the little kid wandered over and kept asking if they could have a try at flying the drone, because it does look like a video game. And of course, right, what's the adult answer? No, obviously not. Like, this drone and this equipment is way too expensive to give to a random 6-year-old. If I say to that 6-year-old, who I don't really know, don't have any real established context with, whose only goal is to try something cool, oh, this is too expensive, you might break it, they may or may not understand the words I'm saying, but they definitely aren't going to understand the implication and the weight of that statement the way an adult would. They're a child. There's no way that they're going to understand this idea that this object that looks like a toy is too expensive for you, even if they understand the words. And so it's important to figure out and reframe that you simplify based on understanding, not just vocabulary. Using simpler words of "it too much money" is not going to solve the problem, because a child cannot be expected to truly understand cost versus expense versus risk. And that's how easy it is to fall afoul here. If they don't get it, you probably didn't ask what they were actually trying to accomplish. And that's really important with Rule 2A. If you understand the outcome, that allows you to reframe your explanation around the outcome, at which point there absolutely is always language that is simple enough, even if that language is quite simply, I can't really explain to you what's going on technically right now in an easy to use language. I simply need you to trust me for a few minutes while I work on this. The computer screen may flicker. So the second part of Rule 2 is that emojis are not the answer. And in terms of being a rule for technical writing, absolute agreement. Emojis have no place in technical writing. In your notes, in a formal technical email, in a technical paper, no emojis, 100% on board with that. They don't help. However, tone does matter in written support. And if you do not go out of your way to specify tone and intent, the end user will make up their own tone and intent to fit the written words you give them. The idea that emotions are not the answer is nonsense, because this is not a technical white paper. You are working with an end user, and clearly conveying tone and intent are important. When you were in high school English class and you had to break down poems and writing around what did the author mean by this? What did the author mean by that? In that really stupid experiment where like they called it red because it was red. Part of this was your English teacher trying to get you to understand the concept of tone and intention in writing. And if you are not an effective enough or skilled enough writer to do that naturally, then yes, basically doing the equivalent of an emoji and stating your tone or intention is an effective and often necessary strategy. So while emojis may not be the answer, expressing emotion and intent in tone absolutely is, and can help so much when you're trying to explain something to somebody. Explain everything as simply as possible in the context of the user's goal or outcome. If you don't know their goal or outcome, stop explaining and start asking. You need to become a doctor asking questions at this point, not a professor giving a dissertation. So the gist of the rule that there is no language simple enough to explain something, sure, at face value, does your user want to know that the cache battery failed on the RAID card and therefore they're going to have some intermittent downtime for the rest of the day while you rebuild their RAID, and performance will be slow and disk IO will be impacted? No, most users do not want to know that. And whether they understand the words or not, they don't care about that. They do care about the outcome and how it impacts their outcome. And understanding that allows you to reframe your language. And if you have not understood that yet and you're just assuming, then you're correct. They won't understand what you're saying because you're not explaining the right thing. So take that step back, figure out what it actually is they want done or they're trying to do that you're there to fix. Reframe your explanation around that. You will always be able to find the simplest language to get your point across and get the user to understand. Stay spicy, and remember, leave the emojis out of your ticket notes. Next week, we'll be combining a few rules because they're related. These are really fun, and they have a lot to do with fault and whose fault things are. And spoiler alert, it's you. It's your fault. You're in tech support. You broke it. You suck. It's all your fault. See you next week. Oh, and by the way, if you have any users or you think you're the end user that actually does want the technical explanation, don't fall for that trap. That is a trap. Unless you are explicitly certain of the other party's level of interest, literacy, and understanding of outcome, don't fall into that trap when an end user tells you that it's okay to get technical with them. Take that more as meeting maybe like a kindergartner who happens to know a lot more than average about dinosaurs. So yes, you can probably talk a little bit more about dinosaurs than you would. They probably still are not going to want to have a conversation about the economics of paleontology. You got to remember that.